there's discrimination already. They didn't give me a microphone rigged on me.
Do you feel disadvantaged? Do you feel this is unfair competition?
Well, my assignment today is to have a dialogue, a conversation, a friendly one, with my friend Richard Haas. I would like to do that by way of asking him a few questions on his book, a landmark work entitled A World in Disarray. First, a semantic question. I looked up for synonyms for disarray and found words like disharmony, disorganization, disorder, and unruliness. And my sense is that it means something is not lined up neatly or nicely. Can you explain which word or which ones best describe what you wanted to say with the word disarray?
Yeah, I will, but you answer. Is there a good word in Korean for it?
Well, I can translate the synonyms, which are like, well, you will not understand anyway.
But they will. Okay. Look, when I wrote the book, I actually took out a thesaurus. I realize that dates me, but Americans of my generation, before there was Google, before you could just go online, we actually had a thesaurus to go look for synonyms. And I was looking at words like disorder, disarray. That seemed to come closest because it's a subjective term of the degree of messiness. Messiness was the other word I looked at. But you can't be the president of the Council on Foreign Relations and use words like messiness. They lack a certain gravitas. I was very careful though to avoid words like anarchy or chaos, because that was much stronger and that was much worse. And indeed, I hope no one ever has to write a book called A World in Chaos or A World in Anarchy, because that would be an unmitigated disaster. So what I wanted to suggest was a world of considerable disorder or messiness, and I just chose the word disarray. I have no better answer than that.
Thank you. Given that meaning, what would you consider to be the most obvious manifestation or manifestations of such a disarray?
I think you can look at it either regionally or globally. I think regionally, the Middle East is the worst. I mean, the analogy I use for those of you who are students of European history, in the early 17th century, you had 30 years of war, the 30 Years' War. And it was both a political war and a religious war. It was within borders and across borders. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing in the Middle East. And what makes this even worse is because of globalization. There's no limit to recruits, no limits to dollars, no limit to essentially the fuel of such a war. So we're seeing a civil war, we're seeing proxy wars, we're seeing regional wars, we're even seeing now an element of major power with the US and Russia. You've got Iran, obviously. So what worries me about this is this could go on for decades. So that the Middle East seems to me the worst part of the world, because in terms of all this. But I worry about this part of the world. This part of the world's been remarkably stable. But I talked about several things. I talked about the large number of unresolved conflicts, many of which go back 60, 70 years or more. You've got the accommodation or how you deal with the arising China on whose terms, on what terms. You have the Indo-Pakistani situation that doesn't get as much attention as it might. You've got the immediate issue of North Korea, conventional nuclear missile. So you'd have to be a real optimist to think either that this part of the world, that all of these challenges would be resolved, or even if they're not resolved, they'd all be successfully and peacefully managed. You'd have to be something of a historical optimist. And then I could say other things about other parts of the world and at the global level. I particularly worry about cyberspace, where the technologies are evolving so quickly, they're in so many hands. Digital and internet life is so central to everything we now do as economies, as militaries, as governments, as societies, as individuals, but there's very few rules. So I've got a long list of things that add up to, that make me comfortable with the word disarray.
You are saying in the book that a global gap is one of the principal reasons for the disarray in the world. Can you explain for us what you mean by a global gap? Is it mainly about between what is desirable and what is possible, or between the tasks and abilities of the entity called the world, or imbalance between nations, such as can be found in something like what is known as Thucydides' trap, or what Joseph Nye calls Kindleberger trap?
It seems to me the Thucydides argument is something fairly different, and that's about the difficulty of managing the rise, in this case of China, with the position of the United States and others. And there's a lot of people who look at history and come away from their reading of history quite pessimistic about the ability of the world to come up with a way of integrating China on terms, how would I put it, that are enough for China and not too much for the rest of us. And I'm not so negative on that, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm simply talking about all these manifestations of globalization, whether it's climate change or cyber or trade or health, you name it. And simply the institutions, rules, arrangements we have in place that simply don't resolve the challenges. And in some cases, the gap is not just large, but growing. We've already talked about cyber. In trade, for example, there's been no new successful global trade round in decades. We have no way of really dealing with certain issues about currencies. We have no way of dealing with certain issues about government subsidies. There's been considerable property theft. Digital commerce is largely unregulated. So there's a gap. And every domain of international life you or I could think of, I would simply say the extent of global consensus falls short of what would be desirable.
Okay. One of the issue areas that you talk about in connection with the global gap is proliferation or non-proliferation of nuclear weapons.
Yep.
You write about the articles you and some other people like Brent Scowcroft and Arnold Cantor wrote in mid-June 1994, calling for preventive strikes against North Korea. Mid-June of 1994, as I remember, was a very, very critical time in dealing with the North Korean nuclear issue. For one thing, I was the foreign minister of South Korea, shuttling from Seoul to and from Beijing and Washington to resolve the issue. In the same week that you wrote the article, Beijing informed us that it told in no uncertain terms that if North Korea does not behave, China informed North Korea, if it didn't behave, China would not exercise the veto on a sanctions vote in the UN Security Council. That is also the week that former President Carter was invited to Pyongyang to have a meeting with President Kim Il-sung. I think the calls for preventive strike against North Korea, even though they were not entertained by the Clinton administration, had a positive effect on Pyongyang in its taking more accommodating behavior afterwards. There are many in Korea today who say that the United States should have done just that is bomb Yongbyon. And then we would not have the North Korean nuclear problem now. Do you agree with that assessment?
I will answer that in about 1 minute, but let me just say one thing in advance, which is coming back to what we were just talking about. Let me speak in the general, then I'll speak about the civic. I think with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the world basically has set the standard that there ought not to be new states, new countries with nuclear weapons beyond, and only the 5 are allowed to have them, and they're meant to gradually get rid of what they have. And obviously, since then, we've had 4 new countries develop nuclear weapons: Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea. So it shows to me that while this standard is there, it hasn't been universally applied. If a country has capabilities and is determined and is willing in many cases to absorb the price of sanctions, as we've seen, they can move quite a long ways towards nuclear weapons. And then once they get nuclear weapons, the world has almost nothing to say. Pakistan, as I said, is producing nuclear warheads now, or nuclear material, faster than anybody else. And the world is simply ignoring it. If North Korea doubles its amount of fissile material, I don't see the world talking about that much. So there's a non-proliferation principle that's not always honored. But once countries cross that threshold, the world essentially has nothing to say. So it seems to me that's one big example where there's a gap. In the case of North Korea, you're right, and I think it was 94, I had left the White House in early 93 when President Bush was defeated in his attempt to get a second term. And I was an academic at the time and wrote this article. And my concern was that if North Korea were allowed to continue to advance, 2 things would happen. It would set a dangerous precedent for other countries, and it itself would advance. And one day would be able to threaten you, Japan, the American forces here. I wasn't imaginative enough to think that they would get the kind of ballistic missile capabilities they now seem to be building. I did argue that we should use military force. Now, I know the Clinton administration looked at it very closely. And it was, in the end, they decided that it was in some ways too risky for fear that it would trigger a conventional military conflict, which would be incredibly costly. I don't think that, and let me put it this way, if the Bush administration, Bush the father, had been reelected in 92, and we had faced that same issue, I'm not sure where we would have come out. When I used to teach at Harvard, when I used to teach foreign policy, I used to say, foreign policy is difficult. It's hard. These are hard issues. These aren't black or white, 90-10 calls. These are right 50-50, very difficult call, and part also because you don't know. You've got to make extraordinarily difficult decisions without knowing what the consequences or ramifications of those decisions might be. All I can say is, I can't tell you we were right not to use force then. What I can say is the decision not to use force then has clearly had enormous consequences. And we are in a very difficult and different position today. And the choices aren't any better. In some ways, the choices are far worse. And again, as I said before, Professor, not acting can be every bit as consequential in our business as acting. So it's hard for me to go back in history and say, if we had done this, it would have definitely been preferable. All I can say is we didn't do certain things, and the world we live in is, shall we say, considerably less than ideal.
Thank you. Let's come back to the present.
Okay.
While we're at it, I have one more question on the North Korean nuclear issue.
Okay.
You say in your book that the United States should try to, quote, buy in, unquote, South Korea and Japan to agree or acquiesce to a preventive, if not preemptive, attack when the situation calls for it. And also should have prior discussions and possibly understanding with China on the same issue. How feasible do you think these efforts will and can be if they are made?
Let's take a step back. I think there's really three general approaches to dealing with the North Korean challenge. One is to live with it and to basically say we don't like it, but we could live with it, and that through some combination of defense and deterrence. And that would mean missile defense system like THAAD and other systems here, Japan, the United States, nuclear deterrence, and so forth. And the problem with that is you have the demonstration, again, that a country can get this far. North Korea could sell or give away certain things, and obviously you can't be 100% certain that deterrence and defense would work perfectly. So it would mean living with tremendous risk and uncertainty. The second option is to use military force of some type in a preventive or preemptive mode, either against a gathering threat or what intelligence showed to be an imminent threat. And the problem there is you can never be sure if you use military force exactly what you will accomplish. And second of all, you obviously can't know how North Korea might retaliate or respond, whether it's with nuclear, biological, chemical, or conventional force, and all that that would entail. So when I look at both of those options, understandably, I see the risks and costs of both of them. So my preferred option is for diplomacy, to try it. I think it's unrealistic in the first instance to try to achieve denuclearization, as much as I'd like to see it. I think there's some type of a ceiling or freeze on North Korean capabilities with intrusive inspections might be something the parties could live with. But I believe that only happens if China is willing to use the influence and leverage it says it doesn't have, but I believe it does. And so I think we need to keep the option of military force alive. But my preference would be to negotiate with China playing a role, whether it's at the table or away from the table. I don't particularly care. And my own view is if China is not willing to play this role, I think one of the things my country and other countries, including this one in Japan, are going to have to think about is whether we introduce significant economic sanctions against China, against Chinese financial institutions and Chinese companies that are in many ways supporting the North Korean regime. I understand the risks of going down that path. But we've reached a point where it's not as though we're stupid and there's some wonderful option we haven't thought about. We only have unattractive options to choose among. So I think we basically either have to live with this, with all the potential costs and risks of that, use military force in one way or another with all the costs and risks of that, or try to create an environment in which negotiations can at least help us put some kind of a ceiling on the problem. And I think that is the least bad option for all concerned, and I would want to explore it fully. One, it might work. Or two, before I turn to any other option, I would want to know that we fully explored that one. I would want to be able to explain to the American people, to people here, to people everywhere, that we tried a diplomatic path, a reasonable compromise path, for whatever reason that was rebuffed or rejected, and therefore we've decided to go down some other path. But sometimes in foreign policy, you try things. If they work, great, But if they don't work, then at least you can point to it and say, we tried, and now reluctantly we have to go to plan B or option B. And I think we owe that to our citizens sometimes.
Well, you didn't quite answer the question about buy-in. Okay. What did you mean by the term buy-in?
Well, again, I think the United States, whichever approach it takes here, means that we have to get our closest allies on board here. And that means the Republic of Korea and Japan. I don't believe the United States can, or should rather, take an approach to this, to the North Korean challenge that's unilateral. We've got to respect the stakes and equities of the South Korean people and the South Korean government. Same thing for Japan and others. So I think this has got to be an alliance consultation, and we need buy-in. We need to come to my strong goal would be to come to a shared commitment. By that I mean buy-in, where the United States, the Republic of Korea, and Japan are on the same page.
Okay, I have a question about geopolitics, particularly about the trilateral relations among Russia, China, and the United States. You suggest in your book that there were times when the United States and China were informally aligned vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. Today, China and Russia seem to be aligned vis-a-vis the United States. China seems to want a regional, that is Asia-Pacific, two-power oligarchy. President Trump, at least before his summit with Xi Jinping last April, seemed to contemplate a US-Russia coalition vis-a-vis China. What is your prospect of how the three-country relationships will evolve in the years to come?
Well, I represent here probably a minority view, and one not necessarily shared by my government or even a lot of people in the field. So let me just say that. Truth in packaging here. Look, Russia and China are two fundamentally different countries. Fundamentally different. China's roughly 9 or 10 times the population of Russia. China has a broad, increasingly modern economy. It's integrated in the region and in the world. China has goals. I understand it. It's not a status quo country, but China's not a revolutionary country. China still understands that its domestic development, its economic development, and its political stability still benefits from a stable external environment. You know, the legacy of Deng Xiaoping, I believe, is still relevant to contemporary China, even if China has greater capacity and in certain situations pushes, shall we say, harder than I would like to see, is more assertive than I'm comfortable with. Russia is fundamentally different. Russia does not have a modern real economy. It's largely dependent on oil and gas. Its goals are not to integrate into the region of the world so much as to change. Whether it's the nature of things in Europe, wants to reestablish Russian influence in its so-called near abroad. You know, the one way I sometimes put it is Mr. Putin doesn't want to make Russia great again, because to make Russia great again would mean Russia would have to have real political and economic reform. Mr. Putin can't support that because that would be a threat to him. He wants Russia to be respected again and feared again, to be seen as a great power again. That's very different. So as a result, I think Russia has a very different view of its relationship with the world, in particular with Europe and the Middle East, than China has with the world. So I worry about a lot of things, as you can tell. There's a lot that keeps me up at night in addition to jet lag on this trip. But Russia and China getting very close is not one of them. I actually think they have, to use a term, they have very different DNA. And I think they have very different futures. I'm actually more optimistic about U.S.-China relations because China's, again, much more integrated into the global economy. I think Russia's potentially, it's more limited in its reach, but it may also be more problematic to deal with. That said, I think we ought to show Russia some respect, and also remember that Mr. Putin's Russia is not necessarily permanent. Russia faces all sorts of internal political dynamics, demographic challenges. We're seeing some pushback now with the various protests. So Mr. Putin, in some ways, is a reaction to the widely felt humiliation that Russians felt after the end of the Cold War and the like. But I'm hoping that one day we will see some evolution and that Russia will be, to take another step back, Russia's always had something of a debate between its European orientation and a more authoritarian, anti-European. And right now it's tilted very dramatically in the direction of authoritarianism and the like. But I don't rule out forever that there might be once again a revival of some of the more European tendencies in Russian political life.
So you don't think there will be real 2 versus 1 kind of situation?
I don't, because again, I don't see where Russian and Chinese, either their nature or their objectives largely, or they may have some tactical agreements, but strategically I think they're on very different trajectories, and they have very different strengths and weaknesses. And by the way, China has its own weaknesses as well. I think too many people in the field tend to overlook some of the internal challenges that both, very different ones, that both Russia and China have to face. History very rarely moves in linear ways. There's very little about history that's inevitable or automatic. And I think there's way too many assumptions about the future trajectories of both Russia and China.
Thank you. According to the Atlantic article on the Obama doctrine by Jeffrey Goldberg, Obama thinks it's necessary to let the adversary, a dangerous adversary, know in advance what the United States would do if he crosses the red line. On the other hand, President Trump says that you should keep the other guy guessing about what the consequences of crossing the red line would be. I get the impression from your book that your view on this is closer to Obama's than Trump's. Am I right about this? And what do you think about these 2 different approaches in dealing with adversaries?
Well, I'm closer to President Obama's with one important caveat, that if you're going to set a red line, you have to then act on it when the adversary crosses it. And I thought it was fine to set a red line about chemical weapons use in Syria. I thought when President Obama didn't respond was one of the biggest, if not the biggest, mistake of his presidency. One that had all sorts of repercussions locally, regionally, and globally. I think in general, as you know, there's different schools of thought about communicating unpredictability or certainty. And my own view is that with our friends and allies, much better to be predictable. I think by definition, allies are depending on you. They need to know. Allies can't be uncertain about what you're going to do. Reliability and predictability are at the heart of alliance relations. So one of the reasons I often disagree with the current president of my country is the idea of keeping others off balance. It may be tactically useful with our foes, with our enemies. I don't think it's ever tactically or strategically useful with our friends. So again, I'm open to unpredictability as a tactic with our adversaries. I actually tend to prefer, though, predictability. But with our friends, I almost never favor unpredictability or uncertainty.
On Syria, according to the same Atlantic article, Obama would take the Tom Sawyer approach, and that is letting the other guy paint the fence.
I like that.
How would you describe or characterize Trump's approach?
Well, it's interesting. First of all, I don't think the Tom Sawyer approach works much. It may have worked for Tom Sawyer, but in foreign policy, I think it's very hard to get others to follow if you're not prepared to lead, and you can't just lead rhetorically. You've got to use the colloquial, you've got to walk the walk and not just talk the talk. So I think if the United States wants others to partner with us, we have to be there. We don't have to do it all, but we have to be prepared to participate. And I think too often recently, particularly under President Obama, we were reluctant to participate, whether it's in Syria, in Libya after the invasion. I think we made the mistake of pulling our troops out of Iraq for a time and so forth. President Trump, as we're sitting here today, his Syria policy, his Middle East policy is very much a work in progress. It's unfolding. And it hasn't been reported on greatly, but we're obviously playing a much larger role in terms of using military force in a place like Yemen against various terrorist positions. But more interestingly is what's happening in Syria. The United States has been taking the lead at trying to kill as many of the ISIS fighters as we can, to remove their hold over territory near the Syrian city of Raqqa. And the problem all along has been, if we succeed at defeating them, how do we secure the liberated territory? We do not, for example, want to see the Syrian government come into that space. That is what the Syrian government wants. That's what the Iranian government, that's what the Russians want. And what I think you're beginning to see in the last week is the growing competition for who takes control of territory that's liberated from ISIS. And you have a kind of Syrian, Russian, Iranian axis that wants the Syrian government or its forces to take control of any liberated territory. And the United States has been working most closely with Syrian Kurds. And we would prefer them, as well as various local Sunni Arab groups. And I think what you're having here is the beginning of the next phase of the Syrian struggle, where essentially the competition for real estate. So this is not competition to remove Bashar al-Assad, the regime. I think that that issue's been temporarily settled. The Assad regime is going to be the government of Syria for some time to come. What's not clear is, what does it mean to be the government of Syria? How much territory does he control? And I think what you're now beginning to see is the struggle. It's the next phase of the struggle. And the United States is obviously on a very different side than Russia, Iran, and the Syrian government. And we've seen how dangerous potentially this could get. And I think for the United States, the question is, who will it partner with in this effort? And how much direct involvement will the United States have? So I think we're getting very close to some very big foreign policy decisions in my country. And I think we all could be entering a new and potentially very dangerous phase of the struggle in Syria.
Well, there was a report as of yesterday that Russia announced or declared that they would attack U.S. planes in some areas.
They said they would track. So the question is, they would turn radars on and things like that. And the question is, what then would we consider to be tolerable? This is where this is getting to be, I think, very dangerous and very risky. And the United States and Russia, up to now, have been relatively successful at, to use the technical word, deconflicting, but managing their joint's not the right word, the fact that both were present and involved militarily in Syria at the same time. And the question now is whether this ability to navigate or manage this coexistence of these two militaries with very different objectives, whether we'll continue to be able to manage it. And I think what we've seen in the last 24, 48 hours are some signals about the difficulties and risks that are inherent in the situation. That just again, walking backwards, one of the reasons that people like me years ago argued for the United States doing more in Syria, because I believe it's become incomparably more complicated now that the Russians are involved. I think 4 or 5 years ago, there were options, however difficult, were less difficult than the options we have now.
Well, I'll ask you one more question about your book, and then we'll come to the questions that our audience have. You talk about world order 1.0 and 1.2. World order 2.0.
Yes, sir.
World order 1.0 essentially is based on agreements or consensus, as you said, concerning autonomy for governments and respect for national borders.
Right.
World War 2.0 has to do with government obligations beyond borders,
right,
such as R2P, climate change, health, cyberspace, etc. I have a couple of questions in this regard. First, it seems that you are suggesting that the enabling factor of World Order 1.0 was or is balance of power. But I don't quite get what the enabling or driving force would be for World Order 2.0.
Well, you're right. The first, the sovereignty, the idea that you can't use force to change borders, yeah, it's based on a balance of power and this principle, but the principle is only respected if there's a balance of power. Sovereign obligation, the idea that governments have the obligation to manage what goes on within their borders if those things could affect others. What would drive that or animate that? Two things. One is that potentially there would be penalties if they did not manage, control, regulate things that go on inside their borders that could have adverse consequences to others. The other is self-interest. Take an issue like climate change. Potentially there's a self-interest in there being some type of a collective response or the outbreak of infectious disease. So this is the reason that one would sign on to this, is that we're all vulnerable if we don't. So this is not, again, I've been called many things. I've never been called an idealist. This is realism, but this is realism adapted for living in a global world. That again, nothing, I mean, what I said up there a half hour ago, nothing stays local for long. So what World Order 2.0 is the recognition that we need a new operating system that reflects the fact that what happens anywhere can get on the highway of globalization and affect others for worse, and we need to find some way of managing that reality.
What would be the operating system for World War 2.0? Is it mostly multilateralism?
Yeah. Various forms of multilateralism. It could be formal, informal. It could be smaller groups, kind of ad hoc. I think it would probably change from issue to issue. And in certain issues like trade, we have a much more defined, we start from a more advanced place. In an issue like cyber, we don't. So I think from issue to issue, we would think about who would participate, what's our inheritance, what are we trying to accomplish, formal or informally at this stage. I think we'd have to be fairly flexible. It would not be necessarily consistency in terms of either process or participation or the product of the agreement. I think it would change from issue to issue.
Okay, thank you very much. And I will paraphrase a question submitted by Mr. Wang Santek of YTN. As you know, a summit meeting is scheduled for June 29th, 9 days from today.
I've heard that.
Between President Trump and President Moon Jae-in. It reminds me of the first summit meeting between President Bush and President Roh Moo-hyun in 2003, soon after Mr. Roh assumed the office. I was the Korean ambassador to Washington at that time, and partly because of that, the meeting came off very well. This time, there are some serious issues hanging over their heads between the two governments.
Sure.
The third issue, what preconditions for dialogue with Pyongyang, and what quid pro quo with Pyongyang on its nuclear weapons. What is your advice and prognosis on the forthcoming Trump-Moon summit meeting?
Let's say one thing at the outset. I don't like the word summit for when the leaders of allied countries meet. Yeah, I grew up in an age where summits were things that the U.S. and Soviet leadership did. To me, summit implies often more adversaries than allies or friends, and more things to be negotiated. Well, this is not a negotiation between your new president and our relatively new president. This is a consultation. This is what allies do, and I hope it becomes regular. This just happens to be their first meeting. But to call it a summit seems to me to get it wrong. I think it's the first consultation, the first meeting between these two democratically elected leaders. And the purpose is not to produce some formal agreement or treaty or communique. It may simply be to get to know each other better, to get comfortable, so then they can pick up the telephone at whatever intervals they want and be more comfortable speaking with each other. They can send their foreign ministers or national security advisors or others to have follow-up talks to get a better sense where the other stands. So again, I think it's wrong to call it a summit, and it's wrong to think that after however many hours of meetings or talks they're going to have in the States, that somehow they're going to resolve the question of how to deal with North Korea in every way. That's almost setting this up for failure. Instead, we ought to be just more realistic. This is the first of what I think will be many meetings, first of what will be many conversations between the two of them and their senior aides. I think there's obviously all the issues with North Korea, the questions you mentioned, Professor Han, about what, if any, preconditions, what ought to be our goals, and so forth. There's questions, obviously, of THAAD, but then there's also other issues. I would hope that the question of Japan and the Republic of Korea will come up. I would expect the question of China will come up in many ways. I expect U.S.-Korean trade, the free trade agreement will come. This will be a broad-based meeting. And it may simply be that they come away with a much better sense of the interests and preferences and considerations of the other. They each then go home, they think about it, and then it sets up a follow-on conversation. So I worry about building pressures and expectations that can't be met. And also, I'd say one other thing. They're each, again, democratically elected politicians. They each will bring to the table it's not simply their preferences, but their own political realities as they see it. And part of this then is to see whether where there's overlap, and then where there's not. And where there's not, then they're each going to have to go back and figure out what they're prepared to do, given the consequences of the two countries not agreeing. But my own view is we've got to be realistic about what can be accomplished in this first set of conversations.
I think that's a good point. My experience is that whatever you call it, summit meeting or leaders meeting, is not really a place where you negotiate nuts and bolts of issues, but it's a place where you get more understanding or confirm whatever is agreed upon in advance by the working level people, and also to establish personal friendship and trust. But everybody expects that they will hammer out whatever differences there are at the summit meeting. And if they have differences that come out. People call it a failure. And if they fail to come up with a big agreement or something, another failure. So this expectation is a very important factor.
Yeah, I think you make a good point. And I would just sort of say it's best to think about this meeting not as a one-off isolated meeting. It's part of a process. And this is a process where the two of these people finally meet. Hopefully they come away more comfortable with each other than not. They come away with a better reading of one another's views, of one another's political situation. And then it's simply a foundation for the next conversation and the next conversation after that and the next conversation and meeting after that. It should not be judged in isolation that this has to produce something. This is part of what will be a process. Essentially, it's what will become a relationship between these two leaders. One day we'll look back on their relationship and we will judge it as either a productive one or not, a successful one or not. But the measure is not what happens next week in Washington.
The next question is by, I suppose, Ms. Yu Ji-hye of 중앙일보. Can you give us a comment on the difference on the deployment of THAAD system between Korea and the United States? Do you think there is a trust issue between allies because of the THAAD issue?
Well, it's obviously one of the issues going to have to be dealt with. My own view is that THAAD is fully justified. It's what's brought it about is the North Korean program, both the reality of it and the potential of it. I'll be honest, I do not understand the Chinese reaction to it. If the Chinese are unhappy with the THAAD system, they ought to do more to rein in North Korea. I think putting pressure on Seoul rather than Pyongyang gets it wrong. This again is in reaction. This system was not built in response to the Chinese system, or it would have been built years ago. This is obviously in response to what North Korea is doing or could do. So I think I simply don't understand the Chinese reaction. My own view is it ought to go ahead. I don't understand the logic of slowing it down in the face of what North Korea is doing, and I worry it could be misinterpreted by North Korea. But this is obviously something for the South Korean government to determine in consultation with the United States.
Okay, the next question is by Mr. Lee Chae-hyun of TV Chosun. I'm sorry, all these questions are by reporters.
I keep hearing the word Chosun, yes.
Right. It's about the tragic death of Otto Warmbier.
Yeah.
And the question is about whether this will have, what kind of impact this will have on U.S.'s policy toward North Korea. And as South Korea is seeking dialogue with North Korea, whether this will have an impact on the coordination and cooperation between the United States and South Korea.
Yeah, I can't make those kinds of predictions. I just don't know. I guess I'd say two things. One is not that we needed any reminders, but this is a real reminder of the brutality of the North Korean regime. Hundreds of thousands of millions of North Koreans have died one way or another from this brutality. This is the most militarized society on the face of the earth. This is tragic, and I think what it will do is remind a new generation of Americans about the nature of the North Korea. And I again, I've been traveling in this part of the world since much of this has happened the last few days. But this has the potential to, in some ways, crystallize a situation and galvanize public opinion. This is not some big abstraction. This is not some geopolitical abstraction. This is a stunningly real situation about this wonderful young man who wanted to go into North Korea. This was part of an experience. Here he was nearby, and this is he loses his life because of it in a brutal way. And this is my hunch is this will, to some extent, this could color the political debate in the United States, because it's, again, as I said before, we're going to have to decide potentially, if negotiations don't work, whether we're prepared to live with a North Korean regime that has certain capabilities that can threaten Americans. This will not make us more likely to do that. This is the kind of thing that will potentially have an impact on American thinking and opinion. More broadly, whether one should be talking to the North Korean regime or not, I've long thought, I believe, look, I'm a former diplomat. I don't believe that talking is a favor we bestow on others. I think negotiations are a tool of statecraft, and I think we should be prepared to have negotiations with others so long as it serves our interest. We have to make sure that any negotiations with North Korea are not simply providing time or a cover for them to advance their nuclear and missile programs. We may have to decide as a result what kind of behavioral changes we would require before negotiations, what kind of freezes on activity. We may have to put time limit on certain negotiations. But I don't think we ought to, I wouldn't rule negotiations or talking out. I wouldn't pay to have them. I think we ought to look at them very coldly as a tool, as one potential instrument that may or may not be better than other potential instruments to use. And this is the sort of thing that I think our presidents ought to be consulting about. Under what circumstances might talking with North Korea in whatever configuration, might this be a preferable foreign policy approach to dealing with this challenge? What kind of a context may increase the odds it would bring the kind of outcome we want? But so I'm very practical. When as I expect you are, as a former diplomat, I'm very practical about talking to adversaries. It's what are the specific terms and what are the alternatives? So as Winston Churchill once said, jaw talking can be the best of all policies. I think the answer is how you structure it and compared to to what alternatives.
There's a question by, I suppose, Ms. Park So-yeon of Financial News about different perspectives in dealing with North Korea between the United States and South Korea. And I'll just paraphrase this question. I served as foreign minister when the South Korean government or the president, President Kim, was taking a harder line toward North Korea than President Clinton in the United States. And I made a lot of effort to bridge the gap. I served as ambassador to Washington when the South Korean president was much more moderate vis-a-vis North Korea than the US president, President Bush. And so I'm quite accustomed to these different perspectives by the two governments.
Sure.
Right now, it looks like President Moon is much more moderate than President Trump is and is likely to be.
Sure.
And in that kind of situation, what is your advice or suggestion as to how to coordinate the differences?
Well, look, it's a big issue, and as you say, it's not unique to this moment. I actually think it's been there from the beginning. And part of the reason's been geography. You know, for the Republic of Korea, North Korea it's right there. And it's across the 38th parallel. And you have understandably, governments in this country have understandably judged policy often through what it would likely mean for stability on the peninsula. And while the United States obviously has troops on the peninsula and cares about stability on the peninsula, the United States has had a larger set of concerns. It's everything from North Korea's own proliferation, its export of various materials. And now we've got the added consideration or concern of North Korea being able to pose a direct threat potentially to the mainland United States. So there's a potential for some friction because we have different priorities. And you were asking me before, Professor Hahn, about 1994. Well, that was part of it. And the question was, even then, should the biggest priority be stopping this nuclear program before it gained momentum, even at the risk of triggering a war on the peninsula, or was that risk too great to even run? And there was a tension. And I don't think we can ever eliminate all the tensions in the U.S.-South Korean relationship. I don't think that's a realistic goal. I think what is realistic is to find ways to get them out there and talk about them and bridge them. And whether we can come up with an approach that the South Korean government and the American government, in certain cases the Japanese government, can all live with, given that we've got different priorities. The Japanese are worried not simply about the North Korean missile threat, but are worried about abductees. You're worried most mainly about stability on the peninsula. We're worried, perhaps now more than ever, about North Korea's ability to pose a direct threat to the United States or be a proliferation threat to the world. So the question is, how can these three allies come together where we have perhaps slightly different ranking of what it is about North Korea that concerns us most? We've all got concerns about North Korea, and the question is then, how do we tailor policies that are commonly acceptable? You know, it's easier to describe problems or challenges than it is to solve them. I understand that. But that's why we have the consultations, to see whether we can't come up with an approach on diplomacy, on sanctions, on conditions when force might be introduced, and so forth, that everybody can accept. And I think there's still an enormous incentive to find common ground, because we're far worse off if we cannot. So I think that's where we are. And I think you make a really important point, sir, which is this is not the first time we have dealt with this. We have dealt with this for decades. And the specifics may change, but the structural differences in priorities, shall we say, this is not the first time we've had to cope with that. And I think we've managed pretty well over the years. And I think what's different now is it's become more acute in terms of the threat posed to the United States. So, and I think, by the way, can I say, I think this would have happened had Hillary Clinton been elected president. I know Mr. Trump, is, shall we say, unique in many ways. But this would have, I believe, we would have had a very similar conversation between President Moon and President Clinton, Hillary Clinton, if she'd been elected, as we are probably going to have between President Moon and President Trump. I think that this would have been the emerging national security priority for any U.S. administration in 2017. So working or trying to bridge any potential differences tactically and strategically between a South Korean government and American government, I think this was probably unavoidable, having to go through this process. So here we are, and again, it's one of the reasons that I think it's a mistake to somehow define the measure of success of next week's meeting is whether the two presidents can come to agreement. That is it's unnecessary and it's unrealistic. I think what you really want is they each go home with a much better appreciation of where the other person stands, why, what his room is for maneuver. Then they can go back and reconsider perhaps some of their own policies, make some adjustments, and then they can resume the consultation. That to me is a much more realistic and constructive approach to next week's meeting.
Thank you. Here's a question by, I suppose, a graduate student, Mr. Ko In-suk. It's about global warming. And I'm paraphrasing this. You are saying that one driving force of World Order 2.0 or coupled is self-interest and possible penalty of not abiding by it. But recently, Mr. Trump withdrew from the 195 nation
Sure.
Paris Climate Agreement. And what does it do to the to World Order
Yeah.
2.0
Well,
and generally?
I oppose the decision for the United States to leave the Paris Agreement, but we also have to be realistic about the limited significance of the Paris Agreement. Even if it's fully lived up to, it's not going to in any way come close to solving the problem posed by climate change. And second of all, I'm not sure the U.S. decision to leave the Paris Agreement will have much effect on U.S. behavior when it comes to the quantity of emissions we put out into the atmosphere. I think that if you look at what really controls the substance of U.S. climate policy, it's less whether we sit around a table in Paris. It's much more what happens at the state level, the local level, what various American manufacturers do, what happens with technology, wind, solar, the shift to natural gas. So, if you remember, history is useful here. The United States never signed the Copenhagen Agreement, as you know, yet we more than met our goals, whereas those who signed it didn't in many cases. So I wouldn't, again, I didn't agree with the decision to take the United States out of Paris, but don't assume that because we're formally now not part of that process, that suddenly we're going to reopen coal plants. We're not. There's the power of technology, there's local politics, there's the marketplace. Certain states have their own regulations about automobile standards. American companies want to export to the world. So I'm unpersuaded that what we did was a lot more than symbolic. So I think it's important not to overread into the climate implications of the United States deciding not to be a party to the Paris Agreement.
Okay, here's a question by Mr. Park Sung-gun of the ROK Air Force Academy. I don't know how you got out of the academy to attend this meeting, but in what ways do you think North Korea has benefited from the world in disarray?
Well, I think North Korea has been both a contributor to it and a beneficiary of it. By definition, it's a contributor to it, the fact that it's gained nuclear weapons and various delivery systems. This is one of the reasons the world's in disarray. It's totally inconsistent with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and indeed, North Korea shows some of the weaknesses of the treaty. that it was able to withdraw from the treaty. The penalties it paid were modest. So it's in that sense, it's very revealing. And again, the world has struggled to come up with an appropriate response to North Korea's behavior. I mean, and I think what North Korea has basically determined that any price it's being asked to pay is worth paying, that it would prefer to have these weapon systems, even at the cost the world is demanding that it pay. So it shows the limits of the world to organize itself in a way to make non-proliferation a reality. So North Korea has contributed to the problem, and it's benefiting from this lack of global, global willingness to act. And I think China bears more than a little of the responsibility here. I think that since North Korea is so fundamentally dependent upon China economically, that I think it shows that China has not yet been willing to accept the sort of obligations it should accept as a great power. And I think this is one area where Chinese behavior is measurably disappointing.
Okay, there was another question about NPT. Despite the existence of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, nuclear non-proliferation, there are many countries becoming new nuclear weapons countries. Do you think, how do you assess the value of the treaty?
Yeah, I would disagree with the premise of the question. The Non-Proliferation Treaty says 5 countries can have nuclear weapons, though they have the obligation to gradually get rid of them. 4 other countries now have nuclear weapons. Okay, but there's over 190 countries in the world. So I guess if you're a pessimist, you can say 4 countries have nuclear weapons that weren't meant to, and Iran is close to that point. If you're an optimist, you'd say that still leaves about 180 countries that don't have nuclear weapons that might otherwise. So I don't think it's a failure. It's just not, it is what it is. It's imperfect, and it shows that countries that are determined to get nuclear weapons, if they have a certain industrial capability, and can be very hard to stop. Again, but we don't see nuclear weapons in Latin America. We don't see them in Africa. You don't have them. This country, Japan, doesn't have them. The NATO countries don't have them. In some ways, what I think this also shows is the most important non-proliferation instrument in the world is not the Non-Proliferation Treaty, it's American alliances. And confidence in American security guarantees has been a powerful disincentive for countries to have their own nuclear weapons programs. But the non-proliferation is one of the tools. It's flawed. It's voluntary. We have to make under it nuclear power available as though there were a complete wall between the technology you need for nuclear power and the technology you need for nuclear weapons. That's not true. So the Non-Proliferation Treaty only allows you to inspect areas that countries say you can inspect. It's a flawed agreement. I understand. It doesn't go nearly far enough. On the other hand, when you look back over the last 3 or 4 decades, it's hard to say we'd be better off if it hadn't come into existence. And again, I think there are other tools that have worked like alliances, but I think we have to be honest and address where it's come up short. North Korea is one, Pakistan is clearly another, and we need to think through what it is we do when the Non-Proliferation Treaty doesn't have the answers. What more can I say?
Okay. I have, this would be the final one. It looks like a good question, but I can't read the handwriting.
Then I think you get to ask whatever question you want. None of us will know if you're reading something that's not there.
And if I can read his name, Hans Schattel from Yonsei University.
His recent article in which he argues that the U.S. has basically abdicated its role of guardian or guarantor of liberal world order by suicide. And number one, do you agree with this interpretation? And then regardless of how you see that, how should East Asia's democracies and liberal democracies, including the Republic of Korea, deal with this issue?
Well, I haven't seen the article, but I've written some not dissimilar things myself. I think the United States, in some ways, has abdicated its position in the world for reasons I don't agree with or necessarily even understand. I think we've been very well served by the world order that's evolved over the last 65 or 70 years. I think the benefits of it have far, far, far outweighed any costs, or to put it in other words, to put it in financial terms, the return on investment has been extraordinary. So I don't quite understand the bias of the current president and several people around him to disrupt large portions of it, whether it's in the area of trade or alliance relationships and so forth. So I'm hoping this is something of an aberration, that either this administration comes to see things differently with experience, or if not, Congress and others assert themselves, and ultimately successor presidents and successor administrations represent something of a return to a more traditional American approach to the world, in which we're prepared to lead, we're prepared to promote an open world trading system, where we do have a bias in favor of democratic regimes that respect human rights, that we do believe in international institutions, and we're prepared to bolster them rather than disrupt them. So, I think that this president represents a departure from the outlines of what has guided American foreign policy, I think, mostly successfully for the last, again, 3/4 of a century. And I think for American allies, I think that then they have the, I tried to get at this in my remarks. I think on one hand, they need to speak truth to power. It's always a little bit awkward for an American to tell non-Americans how to talk to America. But I think that they are free to tell American officials what they think. In my experience, at least when I was an American official, American allies were pretty comfortable telling me what they thought. So when they disagree, or simply when they have different perspectives, they should make them known. The Canadian foreign minister did it quite eloquently the other day on the floor of the Canadian Parliament, about basically speaking to her political colleagues and speaking to her countrymen and saying the United States is clearly taking a different path from the one it's taken for the last 60 or 70 years. This has real repercussions for those of us in Canada. So I think on one hand, you argue what you want to see American foreign policy be to American officials. And on the other hand, I think other countries have to decide what they're prepared to do differently by themselves or with other like-minded countries if the United States is not going to play its traditional role. It's a much more uncertain world. It's a much more decentralized world. I think it's, to be blunt, an unwelcome development. But this is what's happening. So I think it's incumbent upon other governments, in particular, to look what more they can do to uphold regional or global order if the United States is going to play less of a traditional role. I mean, I think reality is, I'll just say one last thing here and then I'll stop. Things just don't work out by themselves. Regions don't become orderly by themselves. The world isn't orderly by itself. It takes effort. And I think if the United States is going to reduce its effort, I think it's very much in the interest of other countries to try to increase their effort. Not so much unilaterally, but collectively with other countries that are like-minded. And so I think it's, again, it's in their self-interest to do so, because no one would benefit, not my country, not any other, from the breakdown of order at the regional or global level. Greater disarray won't help any of us. None of us will be able to insulate ourselves from the consequences of greater disarray. So if the United States, for whatever reasons, is prepared now to do less than it has, then I think it's in the self-interest of others to potentially do more.
Okay, thank you very much. You gave us a very good speech. You gave us even more wonderful interview. And thank you very much.
Because of the interviewer.
Let's give him a big hand.